Brandon Katz, a returning guest, this time on video. And we're going to talk about Godzilla vs. Kong. Let's talk about the story you wrote for Observer. What was that, a week and a half ago? Yeah. Right before the movie had opened? Or no, right after, right? And it done so well. You had the presence of mind to say, does this now lead to a MonsterVerse? Is it all about box office? Because this movie overperformed so well. I mean, it performed so well, and went beyond expectations. Does this now mean there's a future for the MonsterVerse? So Brandon Katz, let's do this thing. Tell me your thoughts on Godzilla versus Kong. And actually now that it's been out for almost 2 weeks now globally, and the performance has been incredible.
Yeah, and thank you for having me back on, Paul. Much appreciated. As we discussed for that article, because you also served as a great on-record source, this overperformed at the box office, particularly in the pandemic, which I don't know if anyone still realizes we are still in economically depressed Hollywood times by a wide margin. So for this film to have now, after a little bit more than 2 weeks, been at, I think, 358 million global, over 70 million domestic, about 290 million, give or take a couple million international. This is huge. It only dropped about 58% in its second weekend. So by all metrics, by all expectations, internally and externally, Godzilla vs. Kong is overperforming, which we have not been able to say in, 13 months about any movie.
Right.
Now, the question becomes, does this guarantee a continuation of the MonsterVerse? That's where it gets a little bit more murky, because originally Toho, the Japanese company, allowed Legendary to license the Godzilla character and ancillary IP within that franchise for 2014's Godzilla, which Legendary distributed alongside Warner Brothers. A year later, after the success of that movie, Warner Brothers and Legendary announced a MonsterVerse that is going to be comprised of Kong Skull Island, Godzilla 2, which became King of the Monsters, and culminating in Godzilla vs. Kong, which we've now finally gotten.
Yeah.
So this movie, unfortunately, marks the end of that public agreement between Warner Brothers and Legendary. And for about a year or so now, Toho has basically been telegraphing that they want to make their own Godzilla movies again. So moving forward, if that is the case, they may reclaim Godzilla and like the Ghidorahs and the Mothras for their own film development, which would leave Legendary still with King Kong, but without one of the two major titans, as they call them. So the future of the MonsterVerse, despite Godzilla vs. Kong's excellent financial performance, to tie a bow on this rant, is uncertain at this time.
Right. And that's because was it Godzilla and Kong together that made the difference? And I think in your story, we talked about Batman and Superman are like these two premier iconic characters. And do you need Godzilla and Kong together? And we also spoke about offline and in the piece about how Guardians of the Galaxy and how other characters that we now regard as A-list characters, back in the day, there was a big question mark surrounding that, because, hey, who would go see a movie about a superhero other than Batman or Superman or even Spider-Man? And the answer is a lot of people go see a lot of those movies if they're good, and if the characters are perfectly cast, and if everything falls perfectly into place. What needs to happen for the MonsterVerse to go forward? Is it the same formula? Just make really kick-ass killer movies and then people will come? Or do people just want to see Godzilla and Kong together in the ring?
It's an excellent question that basically has no easy answers. I don't mean that as a cop-out. You're nice enough to have me on your show. I should come with expert insight.
That was a softball, I'm just...
But the truth is, as we saw with Star Trek until Star Wars returned, and as we saw with other kaiju monsters before Jurassic World returned, those are the marquee space giant monster movies that then basically took out some of the oxygen of, surrounding similar franchises.
Wait, that's a great point. So you're saying if audiences have other similar types of movies, let's say it's a dinosaur rather than a lizard, or a different, maybe in the same milieu, to use a $50 word, then will people go? What do you think on that? Or does it really come down to the movie? Or are you over analyzing this, Brandon?
Well, it's my job to overanalyze, first of all. So I'm always
fair enough.
That. But I think there's something to be said for all of the above. And what I mean is you do see when established premier franchises like a Star Wars or a Jurassic Park / World return, you do see the struggle of competition increase for anyone who's not in that, okay, we are a big branded pre-existing IP.
Right.
Now, Godzilla in 2014, Kong Skull Island in 2016, both did quite well, and both, I would say, generally considered enjoyable movies for the most part. Yeah. Godzilla King of the Monsters did not obviously have the second monster, which is King Kong, and was a more, disappointing film, not one that I would consider a rewatchable movie. That bombed at the box office and really created a kind of emergency situation. People forget that Legendary and Warner Brothers delayed Godzilla vs. Kong long before there was a pandemic because they had to figure out how they could come back and replenish the brand. So moving forward, I do think the degree of difficulty is higher if you're only having one of those monsters and not both together.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you can't succeed, because we have seen it before. What it needs, and what you kind of relayed to me also in that article, was that you need a defined point of view. You need to better develop secondary characters in a similar fashion to what Marvel did with B and C-list characters. And you need high quality. And if you have those, you may not be hitting $1 billion with a Jurassic World still in tow, but you're certainly probably going to generate enough audience interest to continue your franchise as a viable economic movie product in this marketplace.
Well, those are all great points. I'm going to throw a little curveball at you. Can you imagine a situation where, because of HBO Max, that they could create original small screen programming in the MonsterVerse, a la Marvel and others that have done this, kind of ping-ponging the audience back and forth, or keeping the momentum going for a MonsterVerse or any kind of universe by going with a small screen play. But it seems to me that audiences really enjoy seeing those monsters on a big screen. But could that be a way to tie everything together? Or do you think would be a misguided approach? What do you think?
They're already doing that to a certain degree. Legendary, which again owns the King Kong IP, is working with Netflix for an animated Skull Island show. There is no reason why they couldn't extend their partnership also with HBO Max for further adventures in that world, a Hollow Earth continuation. And as we've seen in these last 3 movies, they've also invented a ton of original monsters like the Skull Crawlers and the Hellhawks and other monsters that are new to the kind of Godzilla, King Kong world that are ripe for further development in that same Marvel fashion. I think it's a little bit harder with monsters as opposed to speaking humanoid characters, but the same principles apply. So why not extend that and try to really expand your sphere of influence if you want this to continue, if you're a Legendary?
I think that's really interesting too. The fact that they're already looking at that small screen way, the synergies between the big screen and the small screen. But I have kind of a key question here. Do you think Godzilla versus Kong would have done as well in terms of the expectations, not necessarily box office, but in the pre-pandemic world? In other words, do you think that this was the perfect sweet spot for this film and it actually benefited from being the first, really, I mean, not the first big movie, because we had Tenet and other movies earlier on within the pandemic, but I mean, just a really big, we're kind of approaching summer. Did it just hit that sweet spot? Did people just go because they wanted to experience it? Or did they really want to see Godzilla and Kong? I guess it depends on the person, but I think they just hit it perfectly. And it's meant a lot for the industry because it's something we can all look at that we can say people want to go to the movie theater. So what do you think? Did it just benefit from being in the right place at the right time? Or is it more than that?
Yeah, to take nothing away from the success of the film, I think it did benefit a bit from being that first big blockbuster film in a viable market. As Comscore, your company, points out every week, about 34% of domestic theaters were open for Tenet versus 55% for Godzilla vs. Kong. A major difference. You're talking about thousands and thousands of screens. And so that pent-up audience demand for communal, fresh, blockbuster content in a safer environment with vaccines coming out, I think
Right.
absolutely helped. And I even wrote about this pre-release for Observer. I believe the HBO Max day and date release actually mitigated some of the risk following the extreme financial disappointment of Godzilla King of the Monsters. So I actually think it was a perfect confluence of factors. Having said that, I do think Godzilla vs. Kong, regardless of King of the Monsters, was probably going to be decently successful from a financial standpoint. Did it overperform because of all the right situations all coming together at the right time? Probably, yeah.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning the Comscore numbers, my friend. And it really is interesting to look at the trajectory of both the box office and the number of theaters, the percentage that are open. In the US now, we're over 60%. That's been a long time coming. That's a big deal. North America will be at 60% plus very, very soon. And so the timing is right for other blockbusters to take advantage of this marketplace. Also, while vaccinations are getting out there, but depending on what country we're talking about, and we've talked about this before, every country is having a different, it's not a straight line trajectory up, it's a sort of a sine wave for every country, but we're certainly on the right track. And I think we'll be certainly watching this Godzilla versus Kong, because at as you mentioned, it's got to be at this point over 300 and, I mean, it's got to be approaching, as you said, 358.6 million. So by the time we get the numbers after the next weekend, we could be at 400 million globally. This is during a pandemic, people, and it's a pretty amazing number.
Absolutely. It's insane. And now I'm so interested, will Mortal Kombat continue that momentum? Is that an IP that is suddenly going to be viable enough? As we know, Hollywood has a, let me put this generously, spotted track record with video game adaptation.
Yes, that's true.
Will this benefit from all the factors that we mentioned in that pent up demand? Does the trailer, which has been received well online, generate enough excitement to be like, you know what, I'll check out this crazy martial arts, bloody, ultra violent movie? And how significantly does the HBO Max day and date release play into the box office? So many interesting questions in the industry that Observer, Comscore, we're both trying to in tandem.
We're working it out. We're working it out together with data, analysis, insights, and a little bit of heart, right? A little bit of this. We both love movies. I know you're a big movie fan. I am too. So it's so great to have you on this little bite of box office, or a box office bite for Comscore. I really appreciate it. Brandon Katz with Observer. Check him out online. Read his stories. A very learned man and somebody who really loves movies. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on, Paul. Much appreciated.
I'll see you soon.
Take care.